Hey everyone, the time is 4 o'clock, so we are going to get started. My name is Peter DeWitt, and I'd like to thank you all for joining me, whether you're joining me virtually right now or on the recorded webinar for Principals Month, which is a collaboration between NAESP and NASSP. I'm always honored to work with NASP on this. So like I said, the webinar will be recorded as well. So we're going to get started. We have a couple of poll everywhere questions in here as well. But this comes from a book that I published with Corwin Press and Learning Forward last September called Collaborative Leadership, 6 Influences That Matter Most, and it's based on John Hattie's research. So one of the other thing that I'll be kind of weaving into our hopeful conversation today is the idea that we've got the school climate book as well. So the school climate book came out about a month ago, and that was co-published between Corwin Press and the Ontario Principals Council. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about collaborative leadership, but I'm going to talk about school climate too, because they both go hand in hand for sure. For those of you that don't know about John Hattie's research, Hattie is out of the University of Melbourne. I work with John as a visible learning trainer and for the past 4 years, and I present with him pretty often. And in my Finding Common Ground blog that I wrote for 6 years for Education Week, I used to cover a lot of John's work there as well. John actually wrote the foreword for collaborative leadership. So for those of you that don't know or you need a refresher where John's work is concerned, there are over 1,400 meta-analysis that he has collected over time. 300 million students have been involved in those meta-analysis. And he started out in visible learning, which we refer to as the White Book, back in 2009, with 138 influences on learning. Those influences were anything from feedback to reciprocal teaching to classroom discussion, all of those. Over time, back in 2012, he wrote Visible Learning for Teachers, which we refer to as the Blue Book, that had about 150 influences on learning. Up until about a few months ago, we had 195 influences on learning, and I just presented with John at Hofstra University in Chicago a few weeks ago, and he rolled out 251 influences on learning. So I'll give you the best and the worst. The highest impact influence that John has researched is collective teacher efficacy, something we're going to be talking about a little bit today in this hour that we've got together. That is a 1.57 effect size. On the lower end, which was number 251, the last influence, is actually what he refers to as boredom, and that has a negative 49 effect size. So yes, that was negative. What we were looking for and what is good for you, whether you know John's research or not right now, if you don't know it, you should probably look into it. It would be really great for you, is that we have what's called the hinge point, and that is an effect size that has a 0.40. So a 0.40 equates to a year's worth of growth for a year's input. And Hattie's research, that is referred to as the hinge point. John did not come up with the 0.40. That is an effect size that researchers agreed upon a few decades ago would result in a year's worth of growth for a year's input. So I'll try to weave that in a little bit more as we go through this webinar. Number one thing to think of is who is doing the collaborating. Very often what we find is that principals think their job is to get other people to collaborate. And the reality is, and what we know from self-efficacy research, something else I'll be talking about today, is that you will not feel efficacious in every part of your job. Now that doesn't matter whether you're a teacher who is joining this webinar, a teacher leader, an instructional coach, a specialist, or even a building or district leader. It doesn't matter. You cannot feel efficacious in every part of your job because it's just too complicated. The job, we often get asked to do more with less these days. So what we know from collective efficacy is that that whole collaborative effort is something that's really important. So when we're talking about who is doing the collaborating, it's not always about the students need to do the collaborating, although very important, or the teachers need to do the collaborating at their PLCs. It's also the fact that the principal should be collaborating with their teachers. Now we know that your job, if you are a building principal or a district leader who is taking part in this webinar, your job is very difficult and you cannot possibly collaborate on everything. So what I'm going to ask you to do in this hour that we have together is think about those areas where you can collaborate. Where is one area where you can collaborate more? Maybe it's your, it might be your faculty meeting or something like that. So start thinking about that as we go through, because I don't want you to sit here and do this webinar live or recorded and walk away saying, wow, that was really nice, but not put anything into practice after we're together. What I really also want to be able to focus on is engagement. Is it authentic or compliant? You know, in the classroom, we find that students have to partake in compliant engagement, which is 1, 2, 3, eyes on me, and those kind of things. But what I find is that we often do that to teachers as well. We do that at faculty meetings where the faculty has to sit in the staff meeting as the principal goes through a list of agenda items that the staff needs to know about. And we do that to parents. When parents or families come in to see us, we do a lot of, can you please come for open house and parent-teacher conferences and our celebrations and support our chorus concerts. But when they come in to talk to us about something tough, we do a couple of things. One, we make them make an appointment. And number two, sometimes they start to get a reputation with us and we try to avoid them more than we try to engage them. So this whole leadership idea, this whole thing about learning is supposed to be authentic engagement and not compliant engagement. I'm going to give you a second to read the definition of collaborative leadership, right? So you're going to notice there are a couple of things. Building deep relationships with all stakeholders, understanding self-efficacy, which is a very complicated topic and something that I'm going to try to dive down deeper into today, but also the idea of building collective efficacy to deepen our understanding together. This framework is in the Collaborative Leadership book, and it's also in the School Climate book. What I have found in my time as a school leader, but also in the past 4 years, I've run workshops all over North America, Australia, and spent some time in the UK as well, is that I found that there are sort of 4 leadership styles that we have to pay attention to. And we've all found time in each one of them. And believe me, there are pros and cons to each one. So I don't want you to think that one is bad and one is good, even though you can see in the upper right-hand corner that one is all about collaborators. And because of the fact that this is a collaborative leadership webinar, you're probably thinking that we're going to want to stay in that upper right-hand corner. You can't. So I'm going to go through these relatively quick. Bystanders on the lower left-hand corner. These are people that don't necessarily define a goal, nor do they inspire a lot of collaboration. Sometimes they're reactive more than proactive. But if we look at this whole idea of bystanders in a better way, maybe what we can start to do is think about bystanders will sometimes also be people that don't have to do all the talking and let people define a goal together maybe, where they start to go actually toward that collaborative spirit. So bystanders can have both pros and cons. If we spend too much of our time as a bystander, we're hiding from parents who want to come see us, or we hear that there's an issue with a teacher, but we don't go to them. We wait for them to come to us. Sometimes what can happen is that can create more of a hostile school climate. Speaking of hostile school climate, another thing that can lead to that is the lower right-hand corner, which are regulators. Regulators, in their strongest sense, define the goal and they dictate what should be happening. They do things like check lesson plans on a bi-weekly or tri-weekly cycle, but what happens is they don't necessarily give feedback. Sometimes they just do it because it's a regulation that they want to follow. Other times they expect teachers to be on the same page, pacing at the same time. Sometimes they use the word fidelity, and it doesn't always sound good when they use the word fidelity. But, you know, on the flip side, being a regulator, it can be a good thing because we know that there are some compliance things that need to be handed into schools. I had a friend who was a principal and did a fantastic job when it came to school safety. She knew the protocols, and very often when I had an issue or found a gap where my school safety protocol was concerned, she could help me find it and help me clear it up. So regulators can be very good. On the upper left-hand corner are negotiators. Negotiators tend to be people that define the goal themselves, but they don't necessarily tell you about it. They think you're a part of the process, or they let you think you're a part of the process. And what they can do is have meetings after the meetings. They go into these meetings with one idea, and they intend to walk out with the very same one. And we need to make sure that, negotiation is fine. If you're going to negotiate, just be transparent about it. Don't make people think they have a voice when they don't necessarily have one. On the flip side, though, negotiation can be good. We will, we negotiate with our students, especially our very young ones, which can help them out of a harmful situation. Then on the upper right-hand corner are collaborators. And the thing about collaboration is what I said earlier. We can't possibly collaborate on everything. Our lives are too busy. We have too much going on. And it doesn't matter if you're a teacher, a teacher leader, an instructional coach, or whatever. But the thing about collaboration is that you often walk into a meeting with one idea and you want to walk out with a better one because you build the collective efficacy of the people around you. You learn from the people around you. The hard part about collaboration is that if you try to spend all of your time doing it, you won't get anything done. So you just have to be really conscious about that whole thing between the natural push and pull that happens in schools. We often in John Hattie's work, and outside of John's work too, we talk about the Goldilocks principle. What's too hard, what's too soft, but what's just right. And that's where you try to find the space for collaboration. I have to be honest with you, I'm a big fan of collaboration because of the fact that I didn't have an assistant principal when I was a school principal. And our school community and our school building went through some very tough times, and I could not have been able to do that without the collective efficacy of the staff. Sometimes that was due to crisis moments that we went through, and other times it was just because we had something that we knew collectively we could work on together and come out stronger. Part of this whole idea behind collaboration and just behind leadership in general is that for too often we have been seen as going to the dark side when we went into school leadership. I have to be honest, it's one of the most destructive statements. I know that sometimes I'm uptight and I take this too seriously, but the reality for me is that as soon as we decide we want to go into school leadership, we start being treated differently by the people around us. And they say things like going to the dark side. I don't think leadership is about going to the dark side. I think we have a real opportunity to build that collective efficacy with staff. We have a real opportunity to get to know kids over a long period of time because we follow them from year to year. And we have a real opportunity to get to know families very well as well. So I don't think leadership should be seen as going to the dark side. I think it's an opportunity for us to work collectively together. So it's a statement that we should try to stop doing. One of the things that I want you to focus on while we're together today, and maybe think about when you leave here, is that goal setting has a high effect size. That's a 0.51. And if you remember in John Hattie's research, goal setting, or the effect size of 0.40 equates to a year's worth of growth for a year's input. So 0.51 is really great. What is one area in your leadership, whether you're a teacher leader, an instructional coach, or a building leader, what is one area in your leadership that you would like to collaborate more? And think about that as you're sitting here. Then get an understanding of your current reality. I'm going to give you a personal example on this one. When I was a school principal, I found that my faculty meetings were very much my faculty meetings, and they were mind-numbingly boring. Although I'm funny from time to time, and we had really good food at our faculty meetings, the reality is I actually went through an agenda that just could have been emailed out. So back in 2012, I started flipping my leadership. We co-constructed goals together as a staff, and one of those goals was feedback, another was evidence-based observation. So, but in that process, I had to get an understanding of my current reality. And my current reality was that I was a regulator when it came to faculty meetings. You know, evidence collection. We collect those artifacts, whether it be the evidence that teachers brought to show their level of feedback that they gave to students, or the evidence-based observations, the forms that we kind of went through when we were doing the evidence-based observation, which really resulted in me showing a video of a teacher, and all the teachers had the form that I used to do their observations, and they had to write down all the evidence they saw in this teacher, and it was a video that I used from the teaching channel, so it wasn't somebody we knew, and it made it a little bit easier that way. So I went from goal setting to saying my current reality is that I regulate faculty meetings. I know this by looking at my agendas, and I can tell that nothing that I really focused on was deep learning, and the action step was flipping my faculty meetings to make them more authentic, more engaging. And that's where the collaboration came in, because I worked on that with our Principals Advisory Council, and we co-constructed the goals together. So this is a growth cycle that is in the Collaborative Leadership book, and if you have the book, that's great. Take some time to think about that, but I just want you to be purposeful about just one area in your leadership where you'd like to collaborate more. The other thing that I want you to keep in mind is something that I created for the first book as well, the Collaborative Leadership book. I often found that as school leaders, we spend a lot of time researching and getting to know an initiative and all those kind of pieces before we ever put it into action. The problem is the people on the receiving end don't always have all of the information. They're not in our heads, and maybe that's a good thing. So this MEET, model, and motivate is very much wrapped in self-efficacy. So MEET means that we don't expect people to be where we want them to be. We kind of get an understanding of where they really are before we can move them to the next level. So that takes a lot of questions. That takes getting an understanding of their current reality. So we meet them where they really are and not where we think they are. The next is that we model. One of the contributors to self-efficacy is this idea of vicarious experiences, learning from one another. So modeling means that we show people what success might look like. In John Hattie's language, he talks about learning intentions and success criteria. How will you know you were successful? That's what modeling is. This is how you will know you were successful, because the lesson will look like this. But also in Jim Knight's work on instructional coaching, I've been fortunate enough to learn a lot from Jim. And he has some really great questions, like if you could paint a picture of student engagement, what would that look like? Those are the kind of things that you do that, because there's a disconnect sometimes. If we're an instructional coach or a school principal, and we meet with the teacher and say, when we come in, we're looking for student engagement. Well, if their idea of student engagement is compliant engagement and our idea is authentic engagement, then there's already a disconnect in the conversation that we're having. So meeting together and having those questions means that we ask, what does student engagement look like? Paint a picture for us. And then we model what student engagement really should look like, because it should be authentic. And then we give the people the tools to motivate them to use it on their own, and that's collective efficacy. And I made it sound very simplistic, and I promise I'm going to go a little bit deeper in a couple of minutes. The 6 influences that I'm going to go through, albeit a little bit quickly in the webinar, is instructional leadership has a 0.42 effect size. Collective teacher efficacy has a 1.57. Professional learning and development has a 0.51. Feedback, 0.75. Assessment capable learners has a 1.44, and then family engagement has a 0.49. The interesting thing, and one of the criticisms, there are a couple of criticisms of John's work. Number one is that he took these meta-analysis, which are large studies, and he averaged the effect sizes together, so that instructional leadership effect size is an average, the one of collective efficacy is an average. So you have to know that when you're looking at John's research. But the other thing is, some researchers will look and say, well, that's a huge effect size. Wow, assessment capable learners, that's a 1.44. That's more than triple the hinge point of 0.40. For me, the reality is, I think given the right teacher-student relationships and the right learning strategies and the right teaching strategies, we can get this kind of growth in certain areas out of the students that we're working with. And I'll give you a very personal example. I was retained in 4th grade. I'm the youngest of 5 kids. My dad died when I was in 5th grade. My mom went back to get her GED when I was in 6th grade. I was a sub-sophomore. And that meant that I didn't have enough credits to be a full-fledged sophomore, so I was 2 years older than my peers in my classroom. And we know if you're 2 years older than your peers, you're really at risk of dropping out of school, but that wasn't something I could do because my mom would not allow that, especially since she went back to get her GED, after my dad died, and she had 5 kids. My senior year, I had been running cross-country for a year and a half. My coaches just wanted me to graduate from high school, and I did, but I was ranked 262 out of 266. I was ranked 4th from last in my class. I know you're like, I've already wasted 15 minutes of my webinar with this guy, and he's only 4th from last in his class. But, NASP couldn't get number 250, so you're stuck with me. I actually failed out of 2 community colleges, and then on my 3rd community college, luckily I had a coach named Ron Molson, and he said, DeWitt, you're not going to be a professional runner. You need to go into the Learning Assistance Center. So I walked in with a 1.7 GPA, and I walked out that semester with a 3.86. And now I have 2 master's degrees and a doctorate. So the reality for me is, yes, these effect sizes are large, but given the right relationships and strategies, which I talked about, we can have an impact on more kids than we already have an impact on. So instructional leadership, we're going to go through that first. These are just the things that I put together that I believe contribute to instructional leadership. Number one, both comes from collaborative leadership, but it's also at the heart of the school climate book that I published with Corwin last month, creating an inclusive, safe, and engaging school climate. In many schools, all doesn't always mean all. It means all of the kids who fit in. And all I'm asking is that we try to figure out inclusive images. The images that are up on the walls, the literature that we use in the classroom or the library. Does it depict the students that we have within our school? And if it does depict them, does it depict them in a very positive way? Many years ago when I was a student, Native Americans were not depicted well in our school books, but unfortunately, that is still the case for a lot of our minoritized populations. And minoritized populations are those what are typically referred to as minority populations, but it's just that in reality they're not minorities within their friendship groups or within their own families, so we minoritize them. Being visible and engaging, getting to know names. And Russ Qualia, a friend of mine, Russ Qualia, has done a lot of work around student voice. And a good percentage of the students that he has surveyed, in the well over 1 million students that he surveyed, say that their principals don't know their names. So how can you take the opportunity to get to know more names? When I was a brand new principal, actually even before I officially began, my school secretary gave me a yearbook and said, start studying the pictures of the kids and start studying the pictures of the teachers in the yearbook. Get to know their names that way. So I knew a lot of names before I even met each of those stakeholders. And the other things are pretty self-explanatory, but when I say collaborative leader and instructional coach, I love the instructional coaching model. You goal set with the teacher. You go through the learning with them. Say maybe their goal is using a new teaching strategy in the classroom, like reciprocal teaching. You help them find a resource, and they find a resource too. And then you go into observe them and see how it's working. And then you look for the improvement. You do a baseline and a post. How are the kids not engaged? Did reciprocal teaching help engage the kids more? Visible Learning actually just tweeted something out. They said that on average, this comes from the research of Janet Clinton, on average, teachers ask 200 to 300 questions a day, and students ask 2 questions per student per week. Reciprocal teaching is a way to change that around. So what I'm going to do is Honor Feed is from NASP is going to take over the screen in just a minute because I want to do a poll everywhere on self-efficacy. This is the definition of self-efficacy. It comes from Albert Bandera, and it says 1997, but Bandera's research has been around since 1977. He was a Stanford professor. And self-efficacy, many of you know this, refers to the beliefs we have in our own capabilities. So now I'm going to allow Honor to actually give you a minute or two to go through a poll everywhere that I created to answer some questions. So Honor, it's all you.
Hi. Okay, so I've launched the poll. If you guys would go ahead and answer, the question is self-efficacy is, please select one of the following. Choices are the confidence to take action, situation specific, perfection in every situation, or both A and B. So Peter, we're just waiting now on responses. It looks like everyone is doing a great job. We will close in 10 seconds. 9, 8. Okay, we're about done. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and read you the responses.
Okay, how do we do?
So 19% said the first one, the confidence to take action, and 81% said both A and B.
So should I tell them the answer or just leave them hanging?
No, be good.
So both A and B, and I'm going to explain a little bit about that as we go on. So very good. Okay. So in the screen ahead of you, I'm going to show you why self-efficacy matters. So something like scaffolding. You know, any of these words that we throw out, and I talk a lot about this when I either give a keynote or I run workshops. The collaborative leadership work has been adopted at the state level and university level, which is awesome. And so I get more time to talk about this, but scaffolding is a word that we drop all the time. But the reality is the person on the receiving end of the conversation might not know what scaffolding is. And what happens is that starts to affect their level of self-efficacy. They don't feel confident. So if you've got a teacher with a sense of self-efficacy, especially where scaffolding is concerned, well, then scaffolding is highly likely going to be implemented in the classroom. However, if you've got a teacher where they don't feel efficacious when it comes to scaffolding, and you're talking about it and they're just shaking their head going, okay, sounds good, scaffolding is highly unlikely going to be implemented in the classroom. And for those of you that are instructional coaches, I want you to keep this in mind too, because sometimes instructional coaches tend to be a pretty dynamic group that I get to work with. They're always engaged. They do a lot of reading, a lot of research, and that kind of stuff. But the reality is the person on the receiving end of the conversation might not be as engaged as you think, and you might be dropping an acronym or a word that they don't understand, and that they're a little bit too nervous to tell you. Trust is at the bottom of this. That's why school climate is so important. So when we use words, when we use acronyms, just make sure that the people on the receiving end understand what you're talking about, because I visit a lot of schools. I'm on the road about 47 weeks a year. And the reality is I go to either, like last week I was coaching leaders in Monterey County, California, or I'll go and run workshops. People drop acronyms and I don't always know what they're talking about. And sometimes I'm intimidated to actually ask them. So it's just something to keep in mind as we move forward. The thing about self-efficacy that makes it so difficult, and this comes from my friend Tom Gusky. Tom's been doing a lot of work around self-efficacy, and I'm very thankful for his friendship because he's helped explain this to me and give me a deeper sense of learning. But there must be a built-in mechanism, a protocol, in order to raise somebody's self-efficacy. So that might be your PLCs or your faculty meeting or even your teacher observation. And coaching, instructional coaching, is a built-in mechanism. On the other side, or number two, is evidence that teachers trust, and this is why it's so complicated to raise self-efficacy, because very often we'll use big data, we'll use state testing and stuff like that. Well, teachers don't always trust that. So it's not going to be the evidence that is going to help them raise their self-efficacy. Pasi Sahlberg wrote a book called Finished Leadership for a book series I created for Corwin called the Impact Series, and it just came out about a month ago. And Pasi's book is wonderful, and he says that, use small data to make big change, and this kind of feeds into what Pasi's talking about, because you need to use evidence teachers trust. On the flip side of that, though, is that there are times that teachers will only trust what they made for their own classroom, and that doesn't always mean it's valid and reliable. So just like the Goldilocks principle from before, we have to find what is that evidence that we both can agree on, that we trust. And then the last part, Tom says that the strategy needs to make a difference within weeks and not months. Teachers need to see a difference in student learning. So these are the three pieces that Tom talks about that can help raise self-efficacy. And as you can see, that's what makes it a little bit more complicated. I talked about this a little bit more in the school climate book than I did in the collaborative leadership book. Number 2 is collective efficacy. And you might think you need self-efficacy in order to have collective efficacy, but that's not true. Ken Leithwood, who has been doing leadership research for many decades, said to me in an email one time that leaders do not have to have a sense of self-efficacy in everything in order to build collective efficacy. That's why collective efficacy is so powerful. And that's why I say who is doing the collaborating, because we don't feel efficacious in every part of our job, but we can if we work collectively with staff. And there were many times that I didn't feel efficacious, and I didn't know the words back then. It's not like I was thinking to myself, I'm not efficacious in this area. The reality was I didn't feel efficacious in an area, and I learned that through working collectively with staff. That's what helped raise my sense of self-efficacy. So, collective efficacy. This comes from the definition from Shannon Moran and Barr. Megan Shannon Moran is a wonderful researcher at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. She does a ton of research on collective teacher efficacy, and it's just great work that she does. So if you look up her name and look up collective teacher efficacy, you can actually find scales and those kind of things. One of the things that I will also do for you, whether you are watching this live or you are part of the recorded webinar, is I'm going to provide a resource to honor an NASP that they will send out to you because you signed up. That resource is a Google link, and as every resource that I ever talk about in any workshop or keynote, and actually it's got access to 2 keynotes that I do on collaborative leadership. So you can read more about Megan's work within that. Collective efficacy, though, I do want to go back because many of you will look at collective efficacy and say, I'm still not getting it. What that means is that we have a belief in our team. I remember working with a group of school leaders that also doubled as football coaches. And yes, they really did. It was a very small rural town in the South. And they weren't understanding collective teacher efficacy. And I realized that I needed to speak their language. And what I said was, when you go up against a stronger opponent in a football game, do you believe your team is going to lose? And of course, that made them kind of angry because they don't believe their team is going to lose. And I said, that's collective efficacy. That you believe in your team so much that you believe that they can overcome any obstacle. It doesn't mean they're always going to win, but you believe in them that much. We have that in our football teams. We have that in our sports teams, but we don't often have that in our teachers. And teachers don't often have that in their own classrooms, where they think that working collectively with their students, they can overcome any obstacle. So there are things that help build collective efficacy. Number 1 is a personal performance accomplishment. Personal performance accomplishment is, a cycle that you go through, and you struggled with it at the beginning, but you came through at the end. That's a personal performance accomplishment. Losing weight. Some people will use things like the Lose It app and start exercising more. And, much to what Tom said about seeing a difference within weeks and not months, they start to see that they're losing a pound or 2 pounds. That's a personal performance accomplishment. Number 2 is vicarious experiences. Vicarious experiences are huge. We learn from others. We learn from watching others. The thing is that the person we're learning from, they have to be somebody we trust, or else that's not going to happen. That's why instructional coaching is so important. So vicarious experience means we learn from somebody else, but they have to be somebody we trust. Number 3 is social persuasion. The biggest contributor to social persuasion is actually effective feedback. So we build collective efficacy among each other when we're providing each other with feedback. John Hattie often says that the power of collective efficacy And the importance of collective efficacy is that we always feed that collective efficacy with evidence of impact. So if you're working as a PLC, for an example, and you're working on a teaching strategy in the grade level that you're working in, you start to look for that evidence that you trust, and you start to look for the impact within weeks and not months, and then you take that evidence and you keep feeding the collective efficacy to go deeper with that learning. And number 4 is physiological conditioning. We have to worry about our social emotional health because in schools we get asked to do a lot more with less. And we have students who suffer from trauma. That messes with our social emotional learning. So we just have to make sure that we feed that, that we make sure that we feed that with effective feedback and those kind of pieces. That's why team building is so important. Speaking of team building, that's professional development. I gave you this example already, right? Survived another meeting that should have been an email. The reality is I did this with staff and I changed. And that really kind of led to the collaborative leadership work and a better school climate during some pretty devastating times in our state because of budget cuts and teacher layoffs and those kind of pieces. So professional, Andy Hargraves, Michael Fullen, they have an article that a paper that they wrote for Learning Forward that came out in January, and it's called Call to Action, Putting Teachers Back in the Profession. And what they say is professional learning is, an outcome-based thing that we look at. It might be something like a teaching strategy. It might be we can use reciprocal teaching, where you're looking for the outcome. You're looking for how many students were authentically engaged at the beginning. Now that we went through this learning cycle around reciprocal teaching, so many more students are authentically engaged. That's professional learning. You're looking at that outcome. You're looking at the evidence of impact. Professional development is actually team building. It's the mindfulness piece. And that's very important, especially when you tie it to collective efficacy and the whole idea of physiological conditioning. They're all interrelated. So professional learning and development, we need to give teachers a voice in that. We need to make sure that we're focusing on professional learning and development because it really contributes to our collective efficacy. This is flipping. For those of you that don't know what flipped leadership is, it's like the flipped learning model. It's just at the leadership level. I gave the example of feedback. I found an article in the 2012 edition of ASCD's Educational Leadership. It was written by a late Grant Wiggins. It was an excellent article on feedback. And I sent that out to staff 3 days ahead of our faculty meeting. And I asked them to read it so they could get surface level understanding of feedback. And then they had to bring evidence to show the feedback they were actually giving to students. The important thing, though, was that I started off by saying that I didn't think I did a great job of giving feedback. I was in classrooms every single day. I got to know kids every day. I went in every morning to say good morning. They were called my morning rounds. But the reality is I would walk out saying, great job. And that didn't move learning forward. So I wanted to focus on the feedback that I gave to staff as much as I wanted them to focus on the feedback they gave the students. So an example of flipping is just sending an article, a blog, a video, teaching channel, YouTube, Khan Academy, those kind of things. They view it at their leisure a couple of days ahead of the faculty meeting so they can get surface level learning because remember the language we use, giving people time to reflect on something so they can get some sort of command over it. And then we meet as a group and we share those vicarious experiences of how we're doing it in the classroom. It's all wrapped around self-efficacy and collective efficacy there as well. Another thing that I used, I actually flipped my leadership for the parents too. I would send my communication out before open house or those kind of things. I use TouchCast. It's a free app on your iPad and I believe on your laptop as well. So it's a really great tool, very intuitive. Green screen, teleprompter, all those kind of things. So you can even, write what you want to say in a Word document and cut and paste into the teleprompter. So really great tool that's there for you. I want you to think for a couple of moments, like, what are the big initiatives that you're going after? What could you flip? So I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. I flipped, about feedback and evidence-based observation. But we can flip about things like the growth mindset. What does that really mean? So think about that as you move on. And if you need more information about flipping, that resource that Honor and NASP will send out to you, we'll have more information on that as well. My Principals Advisory Council, I had been talking about them a little bit. I had two co-chairs. They were not yes people. They were people that would give me their feedback, sometimes when I didn't want it. But it was really important to have their voice there. And then the other people were stakeholders from each grade level. I put that as a part of APPR, which was our annual professional performance review, which was basically our teacher's contract. So, you know, it was a great group. We met every month, and we co-constructed goals together. One of the things was, you know, we dealt with morale is low. So we got together and worked collectively to figure out what are the challenges of morale, what does contribute to low morale, and how can we work together to get through it. So Principals Advisory Council, PAC is what I refer to it, was instrumental in moving forward, especially with flipping leadership. But I said there are some high impact strategies. You know, I mentioned earlier before that, you know, we use a lot of words that not everybody on the receiving end might understand. So teacher credibility, how credible our students think we are as teachers. Teacher clarity, how clear were we with our learning intentions and success criteria with our students? Do they really understand what they're supposed to be learning? Have they had a voice in it? Feedback is something I'm going to be talking about next. These are some high impact strategies that come from John's work that you can look into as well. Other places to focus. Surface level versus deep level questions. You know, John says when we present together, and in his research he'll talk about how we stay at the surface level, or other times we just jump into deep. What he's saying is that one isn't better than the other. It's just that we have to make sure we go from surface to deep level. We need to know when to be able to do that, and that's where differentiation kind of comes in, or scaffolding comes into the equation as well. Growth versus fixed mindset. John has research that shows the growth mindset versus fixed mindset has a 0.19 effect size, which is well under the hinge point. That probably surprises a lot of people. I wrote a blog, and you have access to it. You will have access to it in that doc. I wrote a blog called Why the Growth Mindset Won't Work a couple of years ago, and then Carol Dweck wrote a response a couple of months after that, and John just wrote a wonderful guest blog for me back in July before I stepped away from writing the blog on clarity around the growth mindset. Those are all pieces that I think we should have deep conversations about at our faculty meetings. So teacher talk versus student talk, I already mentioned earlier the research of Janet Clinton, who's out of the University of Melbourne, and she has what's called the visible classroom. Negative versus positive interactions. These are all pieces that are really important, and you know, too often as somebody who runs workshops, I heard people say, I wish we had time to talk about this at school. You do at your faculty meeting. And it takes some work to shift it around. It takes some work to get people to understand that we want our faculty meeting to be about learning. But if we explain it and we articulate that and we start moving in that direction, then, you know, in months down the road, the faculty meetings are going to be flipped, and you don't even have to call them flipped faculty meetings. The other pieces, you know, I work with a lot of schools that have PLCs, but their PLCs don't have authentic learning. They're seat time. Teachers have to be there from 3 to 4. These are conversations they could be having. These are deep learning pieces that they could be having, because we could come to a better agreement on what authentic learning actually looks like. The next is feedback, and this is where Honor is going to step in again, because this is where your last poll everywhere is going to be. Feedback has an effect size of 0.75, but I'm going to let Honor step in, and she's going to give you a poll everywhere on what do you know about feedback. Okay, Honor, it's yours.
Okay, so I'm running the second survey here. What is effective feedback? And the answers, possible answers, are just in time for me, information that can do the most good, or only effective when the receiver has a voice in the process, or based on a learning intention and success criteria, or all of the above. So we'll give you a few seconds to do that.
And I'm going to give a little clarity around the first one. It should say just in time, just for me, information that can do the most good. I messed up when I sent that one to Honor. So it's just in time, just for me, information that can do the most good.
All right, we're going to close the poll and share it with everybody.
Oh, look at that.
100%.
This is the smartest webinar group I've come in contact with. So you're right. It is all three, and we're gonna talk about that a little bit more. So what we know from research is that feedback actually only sticks when it's wrapped around a goal, what we refer to in visible learning as the learning intention and success criteria. We have to have that discussion with the teacher. The one I used from Jim Knight. If you could paint a picture of student engagement, what would that look like? You have to have those conversations before you can give effective feedback, because other than that, you're just going to be throwing feedback up against the wall and hoping something sticks. You know, one of the things that I start looking at the structures we have in place when I'm doing, you know, whether it's my own work on collaborative leadership or when I'm doing capability assessments for John in Australia. People talk about walkthroughs all the time, and the reality is I've seen so many principals work really hard to give feedback to their teachers, and they leave feedback sheets. But the problem is the teacher on the receiving end didn't have a voice in the process, so they feel like walkthroughs and feedback are being done to them as opposed to done with them. A few months ago, I wrote on Facebook, you know, tell me a word that you wish could be banished in education. And I ended up writing a blog, like, should these 10 words be banished from education? And people wrote things like rigor, fidelity, but also feedback came up because they feel like they're not getting feedback. They're just getting the perspective from the principal that they didn't have a voice in. So just keep that in mind. If you're leaving back a feedback sheet, is there a time for a teacher to be able to talk to you about it? And if not, what is the purpose of the feedback you're giving? Or if you're just doing a walkthrough and they're not seeing anything that you're writing down on that checklist, you know, what is the purpose of your walkthrough too? Feedback is really important. It's got a huge effect size of 0.75, but it needs these two things. And you also have to keep in mind the work of Stone and Heen. They wrote a fantastic book called Thanks for the Feedback, and I'm sure many of you have read it. Stone and Heen are out of Harvard, and I love this book. It's one of the best books I've read in a long time. What they're saying is that, you know, I'll give feedback to Honor, and Honor gets mad at me, and I'm like, well, I tried to give feedback, but Honor gets upset with me. The reality is Honor had a feedback trigger that came off, and one could be the truth trigger, because she was upset about the substance, or she just finds it to be simply untrue, what I'm saying. Number two is the relationship trigger. I don't have the credibility in her eyes to give her that feedback. Maybe, you know, Honor's a high school teacher, and I was an elementary school teacher turned high school principal, and she's looking saying, you've never taught chemistry before. You don't have the credibility to give me feedback. This happens at home too. If you have a spouse or a partner that doesn't work in education and they tell you everything that needs to change about education, you get upset with them, that's a relationship trigger that's going off. And the last one is the identity trigger. The feedback that we are receiving is so different than the identity we set up for ourselves. You know, we're in the classroom teaching, and we feel like it was such an amazing class that it was like Mr. Holland's opus. And then your principal comes in and gives you feedback, or your instructional coach or your teacher leader comes in to give you feedback, and they say 65% of the kids were actually authentically engaged. And sometimes in teaching, and just like in leadership, we set up an identity we have for ourselves. That's why videotaping can be so huge for us, because it really allows us to see what's really there. So these feedback triggers are really huge, but also besides the feedback triggers, Stone and Heen are talking about 3 forms of feedback. They say that we're looking for all 3 of these. Not all at the same time, but they're all very important. And one is not more important than the other. It just depends on when we're giving it or when we're getting it. Number one is appreciation. We want to be appreciated for the hard work we put into a lesson. Number two is coaching feedback. We want to be told a better way to do it. And number three is evaluative feedback. We want to know where we stand. What Stone and Heen say is that, like I said before, one is not more important than the other, but it's what we're looking for at the time. So say Honor is my principal and I'm the teacher, and she comes in to give to do an observation, and at the end she gives me appreciation feedback, but because it was an observation, I wanted evaluative feedback. It's already missing the mark. What we need to be able to do is kind of have a discussion. And like I said, you've got access to these slides. So you've got access to these 2 slides about feedback triggers and the forms of feedback. This would be a great faculty meeting discussion to be able to have. And then when you're doing that teacher observation cycle with a teacher, focus on what kind of feedback should we expect out of this. Because that way people won't walk out saying, oh, I hate this whole dog and pony show of an observation. They're going to walk out saying, we talked about the fact that I would get evaluative feedback and I got evaluative feedback. So, it's just really important to understand these forms of feedback. So just keep in mind, because feedback is super important. Learning intention and success criteria, you need to have that common understanding. You need to know the feedback triggers, and then you need to understand the 3 forms of feedback. I've mentioned a little bit about that teacher observation cycle, and this is it. When you meet with the teacher before an observation and that pre-observation conversation, do you talk about a goal you should be looking for? Like I would say to one of my teachers that I worked with, what do you want me to see? So I could go in and I knew what to look for. Yes, we have the Danielson form, but I wanted to be able to give them feedback in something they cared about. So we co-constructed it together. I did the observation. I talked to the students and asked them, what are you learning today? Could they answer that? Could they articulate that? And then I would give feedback when we met up again for the post-observation. But I wouldn't always stop there, because maybe it was just something that I had in my head, but when I would read Educational Leadership or Principal Magazine from NASP, or find an article or a blog in Education Week, I would see a resource and say, oh, I know Melissa really cared about that. So I would send it to her and say, hey, just as a follow-up, did you see this resource, and read it? And then when I went in to do a walkthrough, I would be looking for that. And did she put it into practice, or was it a case of self-efficacy where she didn't have the command yet? So we should always be kind of combining these together. They shouldn't be separate entities that we're looking at. Our walkthroughs, our teacher observations, we should try to find the commonalities as much as possible. I always look for common themes when I'm working with groups. They often don't have these separate ideas. I can look and see the connection between them. A perfect example, working with John Hattie and working with Jim Knight. Many people would say, well, that's instructional coaching and that's visible learning. But the reality is I saw commonalities between them. I saw a connection, which is where the collaborative leadership work started to come from as well. So collaborative tips, just in case you're interested. These are in the collaborative leadership book as well. If you're going to meet with the teacher and have a pre-conference, meet in their room, meet in the classroom. Our principal's office, our instructional coaching office, very often has status. We never forget going to the principal's office as a student. Some people still have that same feeling when they're a teacher. So go down their room, meet with them in the classroom, sit on the same side of the table of them. And when you're looking at resources, when you're doing that, you're 100% responsible for your 50%. So if you find a resource on feedback, make sure the teacher finds one as well. Start to have that kind of sharing information, because that builds collective efficacy as well. Assessment Capable Learners has a 1.44, and we're really looking at authentic versus compliant engagement. And we can see this slide worked out well for me, but students need an emotional connection to the classroom. Are we using artifacts that they understand, music and pop culture? Do we understand cultural nuances? I work with a lot of highly diverse schools. This is where you start thinking about, the literature that you have available and the images you have on the walls. And what cultural nuances, what cultural things are they allowed to bring into classrooms? I've done work in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, United States. We all have indigenous populations that are there. There should be a sense of pride that they can carry into schools as well. Is that a part of the greater conversation? For you wondering about minoritized population, these two things are the things I've written about quite a bit in the school climate book because they're definitely a passion of mine. If all really means all, then we need to stop treating kids like outsiders. And if they're a minoritized population, we need to have those images in the curriculum and the literature, and I talk a lot about that in the school climate book, where you're having debates and those kind of things. We need to get an understanding of each other. We need to not look any further than Facebook to understand we're polarized and we're not talking with each other, we're talking at each other. I think we need to get an understanding of each other for us to be able to move on. These are some of the high impact strategies that John has. And if you're looking at it from not just a minoritized population or social emotional learning thing like CASEL, in the school climate book I talk about the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, that's CASEL. They have some wonderful learner dispositions that you can focus on. But if you're not just looking at social emotional learning, you want to look at academic learning too. These are some high impact strategies. Now, we don't have enough time to talk through all of these, but you can look to John's work, or you can look on my Finding Common Ground blog and plug in some of these words because you'll find them there as well. These are things that should be discussed at PLCs and faculty meetings. These are part of critical friendships, instructional coaching conversations, and our teacher observations as well. All right, and they result in deep learning and collective efficacy. These are some other strategies. Once again, you will have access to a blog that I wrote on surface to deep level learning strategies, and you will see this very image. And you'll have access to it on the keynotes as well. But in John's work, he wrote a book with Gregory Donahue, and he talks about if we really want to do surface to deep learning strategy, surface to deep level learning correctly, we need to talk about acquiring surface level to consolidating surface level, to acquiring deep level, to consolidating deep level, and then going into transfer learning. The things on the bottom are the strategies that you can use to get there. So if you're an instructional coach, these are things you can work on with teachers. If you're a principal, these are the things you can discuss as well. All right. And then common language. My first book was called Dignity for All, Safeguarding LGBT Students. LGBT stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. That was actually the topic of my doctoral dissertation, which was how well school administrators safeguard LGBT students. It's something that I'm being asked to talk about a lot. I was at Boston College last week with Andy Hargraves and Young Zhao, talking at an ASCD event on the whole child. It was an international summit. It's work that's been going out to the UK, where I'll start in March. Common language is really important because it creates inclusive language that we all have, and everybody has to have that common understanding, including our families. And this is where I'll end, family engagement. I flipped my leadership for my families because they weren't reading the newsletters because they were long and pretty, but they just weren't reading them because they were long and pretty. So what I needed to tap into was, how do I contact the parents who I can't always see because they work 2 jobs and they can't always get to school? So the first time I flipped my communication, it was actually before open house. And I wrote what flipped communication was, and I created a 5-minute video saying that at open house they were going to be meeting with me for a half an hour before they met with teachers. And we were going to discuss the Dignity for All Students Act, which was anti-bullying legislation. And we were going to discuss the Common Core, and we didn't have a lot of info about the Common Core at the time. So I created a 5-minute video and sent it out through our parent portal called Edline. And at that time, about 65% of the parents were signed up, but I started hearing back from parents within a half an hour. And open house was standing room only, and we had a deep discussion about bullying, what it is and what it's not. We didn't discuss the Common Core as much. But for those of you that work at an elementary level or middle level, you know that bullying is a huge topic to be able to clarify. And it led me into flipping other communication. So I just want to leave you with this. Do you accurately explain what you do in schools? How much are parents in on the secret of school? Do you talk at them or talk with them? Do you use acronyms that they don't understand, or do you use common language that they can't understand to build that bridge? And, you know, in the school, we deal with accountability and mandates. Who is putting out the message? Because they have lots of options on Facebook to hear from parents that might not like you very much. So how much are you contributing to the positive conversations that they should be having about the school? We have so many great things going on in our schools, and yet the rhetoric around education is not always positive. We need to do our part to make sure that we put that positive conversation out. I want to thank you very much for your time. I know I went 1 minute over, but if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And like I said, we will send out that resource for you as well. Thank you very much for being a part of the webinar. Honor.